Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Tell me in the comments below. Now let's get into the story. He came back on a rain-broken afternoon, the kind of late autumn sky that had a hard light to it and left the gutters rattling like small, secretive hearts. Marcus Hale had been away for more than 3 years, long enough for mortar scars in his hands to smooth into calluses, long enough for the house on Cedar Street to become a photograph in his mind rather than a room he could step into with certainty. He recognized the sycamore out front. He recognized the sag in the porch steps where his daughter's small feet had worn them away. The rest felt cooled. The curtains, the iron mailbox, the mailbox with a child sticker half peeled at the edge. All of it looked like someone else had kept the shape of his life while hollowing it of warmth. Days later, a photograph found in a drawer forced those who had turned their backs to bow their heads. It earned the respect of the neighborhood in a way Marcus had not wanted and had never sought. He stopped at the gate, hand on the wrought iron latch. The air smelled of wet leaves and something else, sour and domestic. The faint, familiar odor of children's shampoo mixed with too much bleach. He didn't realize his hand was clenched until the knuckles whitened. Inside, footsteps paused, muffled, then resumed. A child small enough to be lifted against a shoulder was followed by the measured, practiced clicks of a woman's shoes. The cadence of those shoes suited the house. It seemed metronomic, careful, not allowing space for murmurs or mistakes. The first thing he noticed, before he reached for the brass knob, was a drawing pinned to the inside of the front window. It was the kind of drawing that would make any parent soft in the chest. A sun, a crooked house, 3 stick figures holding hands. The color was faint from sun and many washings. The smallest stick figure had a disproportionately large head and big, empty circles for eyes. Around that figure someone had written, in large, careful letters, the name Eli. When the door opened, he saw her. June Carmichael, neat hair, blouse pressed to perfection, smiling like everything had been arranged to please a guest. Her smile was a practiced thing. It fit the kitchen's clean counters, the slightly overpriced print on the wall that said Family First, and a set of unlived-in sofas that gleamed even at the seams. Marcus, her voice was a well-cut invitation. "You're early." He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. He had rehearsed lines, prepared to apologize for being late, for the things he could not fix. What he hadn't imagined was the way silence filled the space between them like a second person. The child, small, ears a fraction of their proper size under a mop of dark hair, hovered at June's side, pressing a small hand to the hem of her skirt. The child's eyes tracked Marcus's face in a way that made his jaw twitch. They were too old for those features, flattened by what he had only known as responsibility and fear. The girl stepped forward, slow as a prayer. She wore a faded sweatshirt with a cartoon astronaut on it and a smear of dried jam near the collarbone. Marcus noted the bruise along the inside of the left wrist, dull, oval, almost the color of tea. The child's fingers curled around a ragged, threadbare teddy bear, the way someone might cling to an old map. "Marcus," June repeated, with the somewhere between smile gone now. "You're back." Something about the way she said it was a measure. Marcus's soldiers, I took the inventory with the cold precision it had been taught. The gap between what she said and what her posture allowed. The steady blink that broke as if timed to steady herself. The way the child's intake of breath sounded too small for the room. "How long have you had them?" he asked instead of an apology, and the question felt like a small detonator when he thought of what he might kindle. "Since you left." Her hands fluttered like an offstage curtain. "I helped. I take care of them. I always have." Her voice offered a story already written. There are lies of omission and lies that proclaim themselves as protection. June's belonged to the latter category. Polished, defensible, always in the right tense. Marcus had liked June once, had trusted her implicitly, sometimes desperately, but trust dulls if unattended. He had left because he believed leaving would save them, that absence and distance could be a kind of armor. He had returned to find the armor kept by someone else, and he felt the old, familiar weight of failure settle against his ribs. He took in the small things. The child's hair, braided nearly perfectly but with one loose strand that smelled faintly of dust and something sweet. a mud-caked sneaker tucked under the table like contraband, a small gray plastic toy truck abandoned on a shelf and somehow still clean. The house was immaculate and not lived in the way a home is, but lived in the way a display is, careful, spendthrift on surfaces, miserly on warmth. "You look good," June said, as if that was all the greeting his coming deserved. Marcus read the sentence like an opposed officer reads a maneuver. Good meant functional, functional meant replaceable if broken. He wanted to say, "Your child is bruised. Your child is trembling at my return. This is not safe." He closed his mouth and instead let the silence sit. Then, impossibly soft and pure against the taut air, the child spoke. "Please save my brother." It was an aside, a flattened piece of graphite between two sentences. So small Marcus only heard it because his soldier's hearing was tuned to life or death shades. The words fell like a confession and a plea. They were not addressed to him. They were addressed to the floor, to the air, perhaps to a brother who may or may not have been in the house that day. They carried a child's geometry, straightforward, direct, entirely devoid of explanation. June's smile stiffened. Her eyes flicked to the child, then to Marcus, then away like she had been stung. "Eli talks sometimes," she said. The platitude poured like a bomb. "He misses his father. He says strange things." "Where's Eli now?" Marcus asked, stepping forward the length of the room. The child took another step back. That small retreat carved lines into Marcus's chest. "At school," June said firmly. "Preschool. He's at preschool. You know that. The school will call you if anything." Her voice slid back into the place it lived in. Certainty, convenience, control. Marcus's memory of that preschool. Bright painted blocks, a shelf of picture books, a woman named Ms. Ortega who smelled of lavender. Rose with a force that made his head ache. Eli had been there before. Eli had been safe. Eli had not been a question mark in a house that only a day ago Marcus believed in. The bruise at the girl's wrist occupied his thoughts the way a map occupies a navigator. A marker telling him that something had altered the route. He didn't know who this child was exactly. She had been described in texts as quiet, obedient, on June's social media feed as shy. But social media had always been a painted window. That the child spoke Essay's name, "Please save my brother," over and over in his head like a drumbeat meant that the simplest explanation was the probable one. There was a child in his former house, and that child's brother might be in danger. He stepped inside. Part 1. The Unsettling Homecoming. Marcus had expected questions. He had not expected them to feel like static, small and incessant, filling the house the way dust fills gaps. He walked through rooms that had been memoirs of a life. Photographs on the mantel, 2 chipped mugs in the drying rack, a patchwork quilt folded at the foot of a bedroom, that had all been reassembled to look cleaner, emptier, more acceptable. Every object was in its place but not speaking. He passed the boys' room and paused at the door. It was made to appear cheerful for the shelves of toys with labels and the alphabet poster along the wall. But a teddy lay near the closet, in the shadow, with one ear chewed and one button gone, and someone, June perhaps, had straightened the bed with the speed of someone who had no time for yesterday. He sat at the kitchen table and watched June pour coffee like she was pouring the same old story for him to sip. Her answers were always prepared. "Ms. Ortega told me you were doing paperwork. Your mail got forwarded. You knew you could call any time." She placed plates with the same economy, cutlery aligned the way a soldier's kit is organized. June was the perfect hostess for a home staged to conceal. Marcus listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of children playing in another part of the house. Televised cartoon laughter, the clatter of blocks. The house smelled like detergent and dinners eaten on schedule. He felt the old war in his chest, memory of nights awake, the taste of dust, the snap of commands given with an economy of syllables. He had been trained to notice the prelude to danger. The way someone's foot tapped when they were lying, the delay that comes before a lie's polish. He asked for permission to see Eli's school files and June offered a polite, practiced refusal. "I have everything here. You can call the school. I'll tell them you're back and they can." Marcus let the sentence hang between them. The child, small and thin, watched him silently, eyes the color of old pennies. Marcus recognized something in those eyes, an intelligence that had been forced to count the cost of breathing. He wanted to scoop the child into his arms, to hold and to protect, but he also knew that to act like that would jeopardize every shred of the investigation he had already decided was necessary. He drifted toward the pantry without conscious intention. The small things you don't look at contain the truth sometimes. An unwashed cup with dried jam, a child's sticker clinging to a jar, the half-eaten crusts of bread hidden in the back of a container. He opened the pantry and found a box of bandages. The seal was new, nothing extraordinary, but in the crumb-littered bottom he found a torn piece of paper. A child's drawing, folded and creased, smudged with a hand that had not had enough to eat. There were 2 stick figures, one labeled M and one labeled E. Around them were jagged lines, and one figure had a black circle, wrong and extra, about its wrist. He folded the paper into his pocket like a bullet. He didn't show June. He didn't show the child. He sat back down and let the grief coil inside him. He had left. He had thought distance would shield his family. He hadn't known what else to do, hadn't known it would be June's face, her ease and precise manner, that would have the effect of an invisible hand, guiding his children's lives the way a puppeteer keeps strings unnoticeable. That night, he slept on the couch where the quilt still smelled faintly of a child's hair. He woke at 3 a.m. to the house settling like a body trying to bide its time. In the raw dark he heard it again, a whisper so small it might have been the pipes. "Please save my brother." The voice was the same as the one he had heard at the door, tiny and raw and perfectly certain about the thing it demanded. He went to the child's room and found her awake, knees pulled to her chest, eyes glinting with a tiredness too old for her years. She clutched the ragged bear like a talisman. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, and in the small, private light he allowed himself to remember why he had fought, what he had been defending. He had failed once. He wouldn't fail again. Part 2. The perfect facade. June's house was the kind of place that made neighbors proud to borrow sugar from, no, to parade their trust in. June had poured herself into the role of perfect guardian, with a zeal that made neighbors get used to congratulating her at block parties, leaving casseroles, praising the way she walked the children to school with matching backpacks and perfectly tied shoes. She posted pictures on neighborhood groups, picnic blankets, playdates, laughter. Her voicemail thanked teachers politely, took notes, made appointments for piano lessons and pediatric checkups. No one had cause to look beneath the surface. On the 3rd morning, Marcus sat at the kitchen table and watched June perform her hosting ritual again. The coffee, the smile, the offer of a plate. He watched how she used a small, quiet steel in her voice when dealing with snotty colleagues, how she would trim the edges of conversation to allow for no messy truths. Because he had been trained to parse meaning in margins, he watched the room for the misalignments. They had a meal that felt like a stage. Muffins uniformly split, orange juice without pulp, eggs arranged in a way that suggested attention to nutritional labels. June served each plate with a flourish. "We try to keep things healthy here," she said, the word try a soft deflection. The child at the table ate slowly, not making a sound. When a fork clinked, her head flicked up like a rabbit catching an unfamiliar sound. Marcus noticed how her hands hovered over the cutlery, as if afraid to make too much noise. The bruise on her wrist showed again when she reached for the milk and pulled it back in instinctive fear. For an hour Marcus steeled himself and made small talk, about school, about the old dog that used to sleep in the corner, about the neighbor's stray cat. He noticed the way June answered questions. A practiced pivot, a smooth generality. When Marcus asked about the bruise on the child's wrist, June called it a scratch, and said she must have bumped it on the playground. "Arena," she said, correcting him with a soft smile that kept his tone in check. "He must have bumped it on the playground. Kids get scratches. We keep an eye on them." The child didn't correct June. She simply ate, staring down at her plate. Marcus watched her like a man surveying a trap he thought he knew the shape of. Picture frames along the mantel displayed images of school plays and Halloween costumes. There were no photographs of the 2 children together, or not recent ones. The house had been rearranged to remove intimacies that might reveal real patterns. He felt a kind of fury that surfaced like bile. He asked for a moment alone with the child, a human touch hidden among formalities. June agreed with an ease that made him suspect. The child's fingers tightened on the teddy and she shook her head. Marcus knelt and offered nothing more complicated than his trucker hands, calloused and steady. For a beat, she let him touch the bear. The fabric was thin there, fabric worn to names. Her eyes met his and the gaze was that of someone who had rehearsed being small. "What's your name?" Marcus asked gently. She answered with the single word he had heard. "Eli." It was a name, small as a stone. "Eli," he said aloud, testing the sound. The child nodded, and then, like something slipped into her mouth and swallowed, she looked away. When he asked about the brother, she whispered, "Please save my brother." It was not the child's first request, and Marcus understood that whispers meant prior rehearsals. The child's voice expected no rescue, only the echo of the plea. He left the conversation with more questions than answers and something else that had a weight in his chest. Grief for the warm memory of his wife, gone 2 winters now. He had failed her once, not in the sense of blame but in the small, still unbearable way of not being enough. He had believed leaving and building would shield his family. He had been a soldier trained to order his life around missions. That mission had been interrupted by a domestic implosion he had not foreseen. Now, faced with a child who whispered please in the night, Marcus felt the old instincts recalibrate. He would be the protector, not just a memory. He sat in the car after leaving the house and watched through the rain-smeared windshield as June walked back to the porch with the children. She had an arm around the girl's shoulder in a manner that to the casual eye would be a comfort. To Marcus it felt like a harness. He made a plan, not one of rushed rescue but of quiet observation. His life in the military had taught him that the most effective plans are those that wait for the enemy to show their hand, then close without warning. He spent the afternoon gathering what he could without raising suspicion. Checkbook records, neighborhood social posts, a photograph of June shaking hands with the principal at the school. He noticed a detail. June's last name appeared on the title to the house. The deed was in her name. They had been evicted in his absence. June had signed papers and walked himself and his children into a life where she controlled the terms and the surface. He called an old friend, Sergeant Alvarez, who had handled military police before leaving the service. Alvarez listened with an old, quick competence. "You watch her," he said. "Call me when you get more. Don't bring this to the street until you have more." Marcus had not expected to ask for permission from anyone, but he found an odd relief in the formalities of an ally. He felt his old sense of mission reawaken. He was back in a world where actions could be staged and effects measured. He would protect his children with the same precise, unsentimental method that had kept him alive overseas. He would find the truth. Part 3: Cracks in the Wall. The first witness was a neighbor named Mrs. Langley, a woman in her 70s who fed birds 3 times a day and left dishes of water on the stoop for strays. She had watched the children grow and had once knitted each of them a little hat in the pale yellow that meant someone had cared enough to give a gift. Marcus found her at her window, curtains parted. "You've grown," she said, as if he were a boy returning from a long mission. She used the present perfect tense, as if to acknowledge then and now in the same breath. Marcus sat on the stoop and listened to the flapping of her curtains. "Ms. Langley, how long have the Carmichaels been in the house?" "June? Years now. Since you left, huh?" Her face folded like paper. She kept things tidy. Too tidy. She was always too tidy. She tapped the windowsill with a gnarled finger. "Eli, the little one, always seemed thin. She kept him in the house a lot. Said it was for his allergies." "The doctor? Did you ever see anything that concerned you?" Marcus asked. Mrs. Langley hesitated the way someone reaches into a memory too loaded to trust. "Sometimes I heard a cry, not the playful kind, a smaller, lower sound, sometimes at odd hours. I thought maybe kids do that when they get scared. Once I saw June tell the bigger one to be quiet so the neighbors wouldn't hear. I thought my mind was playing games. Did you ever see any marks?" She pointed to the mailbox. He used to come out with his jacket on even in the heat in summer. He'd keep his sleeves rolled down no matter the day. One time I saw a mark on the angle of his arm. Not pretty, her voice sank to a whisper. I told myself not to pry. The witness was careful with her words, as if the fear of being wrong held her tongue. But Marcus could read the lines etched in her face like a map to modest courage. She had seen but not known what seeing meant. He left with a new data point and the sense that others might be watching but unwilling to break the thin membrane between neighborly concern and courageous action. On Friday, Marcus found Ms. Ortega, Eli and the girls' preschool teacher. She sat in an office lined with children's paintings and a dried-up fern. They are such marvelous kids, she said, warm and honest, but with a tremor that betrayed worry. Eli used to come in full of life. Lately he has been quiet. He used to draw houses with suns. Now his suns are half-colored and small. He started drawing hands as if they were shackled. I brought it up to the social worker, but there's only so much one can do. When Marcus asked about absenteeism, she hesitated. June's always called in very reassuring. But sometimes June refuses to let Eli attend aftercare, takes him early, claims there's a personal reason. Once, a while ago, Eli arrived with a bruise on his wrist. I asked, and June said he'd caught it on the monkey bars. I made a note. I wasn't sure to bring in Child Protective Services because June is so convincing. She insists she is protecting them from bad influences. The teacher's testimony, delivered in small, precise sentences, compiled a picture. June had a pattern of controlling behavior peppered with plausible reasons. Marcus listened, nodding, lining each piece of testimony into his mental ledger. At home that day, while June was out arranging a dentist appointment, Marcus searched the study she used as a home office. The doorway creaked. His breathing sharpened. He knew how to search stealthily, to read drawers without leaving prints of intention. He found receipts for considerable sums to a private tutoring service. Odd bank transfers that didn't add up to familial idiocy but to a ledger of paid compliance. There were lists, schedules, meal plans, diagrams of social interactions meant to sculpt children's behaviors. A small spiral-bound notebook contained a final entry that made his stomach drop. Keep them attentive. Do not let them draw the brother. Prevent questions about the other room. He sat down on the floor and let the journal's black ink bloom into a map of cruelty. The language was clinical, the orders systematic. Marcus felt a new kind of rage, one that did not shout but moved like water under an ice sheet, cold, inexorable. He folded the notebook into his jacket and left it in a drawer as if he hadn't found it. Then he found the photograph. It had been tucked behind a stack of school newsletters. A candid, almost blurred image of the two children. The little girl's face was turned away, but her hand had imprinted a dark smudge on the boy's cheek. The smudge looked like a child's attempt to hide an injury. There was also a series of drawings, secreted beneath a book. Suns with crossed rays, homes with locked doors, a stairwell with a figure curled in the corner. The child's hand had drawn a small circle around a door handle and labeled it with the word "No." He kept all of it in his head, a slave to method. He had enough to begin to move, but not enough to confront. He called Sergeant Alvarez and explained the pieces without showing the fruits of his search. Alvarez's voice was quick and professional. File complaints. You do this right, Marcus. Build the case. Get them in family services' hands before you reveal everything. You don't want to lose them because of a vigilant but clumsy rescue. He made an appointment with a lawyer friend and arranged a discreet background check. He spoke to social workers in the city under the guise of being a concerned relative. Each step was measured, deliberate, the kind of patience drilled into him when he had to wait out a sniper in the desert. The longer he watched, the more the house's small, staged domesticity read like a theater set hiding something rotten at the back. Part 4. The Instrument of Cruelty. The instrument was not a weapon in the cinematic sense. It was a thing of small, insidious function, an implement that at first glance was ordinary. A set of household implements that June claimed were for sensory therapy. There were brushes, small slatted implements designed for scrubbing, thick rubber bands, and in a drawer beneath a tea towel Marcus found a sealed bag containing a child's set of medical gauze and an old, stained pair of latex gloves. There was a bottle of harsh antiseptic with instructions that read more like a manual for cleaning than for healing. He found the drawer because Mrs. Langley's memory had been specific about June's attention to cleanliness bordering on ceremony. Marcus required the private space that allowed him to look thoroughly. He walked into the bathroom when June's back was turned, humming as if to be absorbed in domesticity. June's desk, her files, all bore her handwriting neat, titled. Marcus eased open the undersink cabinet and his fingers brushed cold plastic. He pulled out a small tin and a bundle of cloth. The smell that rose up was sharp and clinical. It registered against his soldier's senses as an apparatus for control. Instruments that could be used to cut, to press, to coerce a child into compliance without leaving obvious signs of injury. There were small, homemade restraints in a box tucked beneath towels. A child's sock with an elastic band sewn into it. A broken piece of a handheld brush with plastic teeth filed smooth and a little hook at the end. It was meant for scrubbing, but befitting an imaginative cruelty, the brush's hook could be used to prick, to coerce, to take a child's compliance through slow erosion rather than brute force. He took a breath and forced his body not to react. His training told him that discoveries must be used strategically, not violently. He packed the evidence quietly into his bag, taking a photograph with his phone for record, and reassembled the drawer as it had been, like a man setting a trap. The shrine of normalcy that June maintained depended on keeping those implements unseen. She had a philosophy that conflated control with protection, punishment disguised as therapy. Marcus imagined her speaking to herself in the mirror. "I am keeping them safe," he imagined the child's small face registering the difference. Safe for June's reputation but unsafe in the small cipher of the home, where soft hands were turned into instruments of making small boys quiet. After he left the study that night, Marcus sat against the house with his back to the rain-slick brick and tried to let the discovery settle into the slow arithmetic of a court case. He did not permit himself the violent fantasies that thrummed under his skin. Instead he began to make lists, witnesses to call, documents to obtain, people who could corroborate the presence of implements. This was a legal war, he told himself. Soldiers won by discipline. He wrote a plan, gather corroboration, set a trap that would allow social services to enter legally, ensure the children's safety without causing unnecessary disruption, and then, only then, confront June with the evidence in a way that would not get the children further entangled with her retaliations. The plan ate the night. He drank coffee until 3 a.m. He drove the silent streets like a man making a reconnaissance of his own life. Part 5: The Soldier's Patience. Marcus learned to wait in a way he had not since deployments overseas. The waiting was like holding a held breath that might never be released. It made his muscles ache. He kept his face neutral around June, who seemed to radiate an easier warmth when he was present that he found revolting. She performed, as always, offering discussions about gardening and church functions, and when asked about the children's well-being she provided an immaculate dossier of pediatrician notes. Notes that now, with the full force of suspicion, he wanted verified. He called the pediatrician's office and asked to speak to the clerk. June had given the name of Dr. Rosen, a practitioner whose clinic served the neighborhood. The receptionist's voice was friendly but paper-thin. "Dr. Rosen is retiring this year," she said. "But yes, Ms. Carmichael is listed as legal guardian on the chart. Do you have records of bruise-related visits?" Marcus asked. A pause. Then, "We had an appointment once for a wrist pain. Ms. Carmichael explained it as a sprain. We didn't report anything. We are not mandated to report every injury, sir." He made time for normality in a kind of sacrament. At the park he pushed a cart with the little girl and let her set toys into a small circle. He let her choose the route to the swings and pretended he enjoyed the slouching talk that felt like the world. The child's body relaxed barely, just enough that when she clutched the teddy and pressed it hard to her chest as if to test whether it would break, Marcus felt something open. He wanted to demand the truth, to tear June's lies like rotted wallpaper, but years in service had taught him to be patient. You wait for the opponent to reveal the crucial corner of their pattern. One afternoon, as rain began to thread the sky, The child whispered in her sleep on the bench. Marcus's heart thudded as if the sound were evidence itself. He felt himself awaken an old tenderness that had been tucked away in a pocket of memory. Lullabies sung in the dim of nights when he would read until the house slept. He placed his hand flat against the child's back and felt it rise and fall slowly. It was the simplicity of a soldier finding cover. He could not afford to yield himself to tender impulses to risk the greater mission. He continued to build his case. The background check on June disclosed a childhood in which she had been the charged victim of a household where control was learned as a survival mechanism. A sealed juvenile record meant a court had found sufficient wrongdoing in her adolescence, but there was scant public record because it had been settled. When he brought this to Alvarez, he noticed the former sergeant's mouth tighten. "She's projecting," Alvarez said. "People who hurt others a lot of times are people who were hurt because it kept them alive when they were kids." That sentence hollowed him in a way he hadn't expected. He did not hate the idea of June being a product of her own hurt. He only hated that the children had become a medium for her survival. Hate, he had learned, was less useful than method. The child, when she could bear it, gave him a moment of connection that felt like oxygen. One evening as Marcus was tucking the child into bed under a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar, she reached up and placed his hand against her cheek. For a second her fingers curled around his. She whispered, "Please save my brother." This time there was a tenderness in the plea, the kind that cut deeper. Trust wrapped in desperate clarity. Part 6. The Buried Past. Alvarez was the ally Marcus leaned on, the one contact who could get a file moved across bureaucracies. Marcus visited a social worker who had once worked with vulnerable families and who confirmed the psychological pattern he'd suspected. June's childhood, marked by neglect and shame, had given her a script. In that script, the child is the vessel of apparent obedience. Marcus was careful to think in legal terms. There was motive, there was method, there was opportunity. The social worker handed Marcus a file he hadn't expected, an advocate's old notes pointing to June's obsession with discipline and quieting. There was an entry. June believes in corrective techniques at home to prevent disruptive behavior seen in other families. Witnesses report that she is over-solicitous of children's routines. No criminal charges filed because no overt injuries were documented. Marcus sat in his car and read the words with a kind of fascinated, overwhelmed calm. He felt his own past slip in like fog. He remembered the last letter he'd gotten from his late wife, Maya, before the sickness took her voice. In that letter she had asked him to promise that if anything happened to her, he would keep the children safe. He had left to give them a life of financial security and, in doing so, allowed another's facade to fill the vacuum. That failure was the forge in which his resolve hardened. As the ally provided records, Marcus learned other things. June had, years earlier, worked at a facility for troubled youths where she had been praised for control measures, where her methods were whispered about as effective. Former colleagues remembered her as someone who believed in strict measures. A sealed note in an old file implied she had been investigated for using overbearing control on a foster child who later ran away. The file had been closed due to lack of evidence and the child's unwillingness to speak. He felt the presence of a pattern. June's life had been a chain of institutionalizing pain, each link forging a behavior of dominance meant to protect her from the unpredictability she'd once known. Marcus's mind traced the cruel arc. The world had taught her to solve her own trauma with coercion. Now she had children in her hands and no one to disarm her. Back at the house, June's behavior shifted. She was more watchful, less carefree. She corrected the children in tone enough to cause the smallest flinch. Once, at dinner, she raised her voice at the girl over a spilled cup and the girl recoiled so visibly Marcus's jaw clenched. That evening, after June had closed the curtains and arranged the children's beds with the relentless precision of a steward, she sat at the table and drank tea as if she hadn't broken anyone in the room. She spoke of the new yoga class at the community center, of the volunteer hours she'd logged. She was intent on proving her normalcy. Then came the mistake. It was small but glaring. June, in a fit of excluded control, left a phone unlocked at the kitchen counter with messages visible. They were from an account that traded in dark approval. someone who praised her discipline tactics and offered to help cover up bruises if needed. There were texts about keeping them quiet and checking the little one doesn't talk. Marcus saw his opening. He photographed the screen and closed the phone as if nothing had happened. He waited. The mistake meant she had let a piece of her private life into the public record. In a lawful world, mistakes like that would bring down a facade. Marcus was patient, but the trick was to convert that mistake into a legal intervention that would take the children to safety. Part 7: The Facade Shatters. The plan required a confrontation not designed to break June physically but to make the world see the person she had become. Marcus arranged for a meeting with a school official, a social worker, and Sergeant Alvarez at the house. He arranged the meeting like a veteran planning a precise operation. Timing, witnesses, legal cover. June came to the living room with the same immaculate posture. When she saw the group, she smiled, the brittle smile of someone who had planned for every occasion. "What's all this?" she asked. Her voice was even. There was pride in it, pride that masked a ferocity beneath. Marcus felt the old soldier's clarity. He presented the evidence calmly. The notarized photographs of the implements, the signed statements from Mrs. Langley and Ms. Ortega, the photographs of the bruises and drawings hidden in the study, the texts on the unlocked phone. He placed the essay of June's own notes on the coffee table like a legal incision. "Keep them attentive. Do not let them draw the brother." June's face did not change at first. It was as if a mask had been planned with a reserved face that never expected to be called into crisis. Then her composure cracked. It was small at first. A blink, a sudden tightening of the jaw. She insisted on correctives and explanations that sounded rehearsed but absurd when placed beside the raw testimony being presented. "You do not know what you're talking about," she said, voice pitched high. "I'm their protector. I keep them safe." Alvarez's voice stayed calm, but the social worker asked firmly for permission to make an immediate assessment. Marcus watched June's eyes flick to the child, then to Eli's empty seat on the couch, where his coat had been hung, and he made a choice. He asked the child to come over. The small boy obeyed, dragging the teddy by one loose arm. "Who is Eli?" he asked softly. June's voice was clipped. "He's the boy's brother. He's at a special program today." Her hands moved too quickly to prove a point. "Everything is fine. You can't just—" "Do you want to tell the truth now, June?" Marcus asked, keeping his own voice low. It was the kind of question that demanded no theatrical answer. June's face went red and then pale. She reached into her pocket and produced a small, photocopied letter claiming guardianship and mental fitness recommendations from an unnamed counselor. "I have everything in order," she said. "I am doing what's right." The child's small voice surprised everyone. "Please save my brother," she said again. But this time she pointed to an armchair and the door behind it with a small, precise gesture indicating a locked door in the hall. "He doesn't come out of the room when it's raining." The social worker rose immediately, calling the local authorities. The timbre of the house shifted when the word authorities entered the room. June's control faltered. She became defensive and then louder, her sentences like brittle twigs. "You can't just, this is an invasion. He is fine. You are hurting my family." People who hide bones in the back of the closet often scatter when the wind starts. June's scattering was messy and loud. Marcus watched as the door opened and the police stepped into the living room and toward the hall with professional motions. They asked the children to remain seated. They asked June to step into the kitchen. She moved like a caged animal. The officer knocked on the locked door, an ordinary bedroom door with a deadbolt. It was June's favorite symbol of control, a lock and a key that made her authority inviolable. The police asked for permission to enter. June's mouth opened and closed. The neighbor, Mrs. Langley, had arrived, her hands trembling. Ms. Ortega's face was white but resolute. The officer informed June she was being asked to open the door under a welfare check. Her refusal would trigger a more forceful entry. She bellowed that they had no right. It was a spectacle. The sound of sacralized calm tearing open is like the moment a curtain is ripped down in a theater and the set revealed as falsity. June's rage peaked into hysteria. She screamed about privacy and propriety and protection. The policemen exchanged weary glances and made the call to enter. They found a small, dim room that smelled faintly of dust and old syrup, a room with a small bed in the corner and a door with no window. Eli sat curled beneath a blanket. He flinched as the door opened, small eyes bright with alarm and pleas that had no voice. He had a small bandage at the wrist. Through the small window of his solace, he looked like a child who had been held in place by love that mistook control for care. The officers moved with gentle carefulness. Eli did not rush into their arms. He remained still, as if the world had taught him inertia. One of the officers slid a blanket around his shoulders and asked, quietly, "Do you want to go out and sit in the living room?" Eli nodded like someone complying with an order. June sobbed into her hands, an effect intended to cast doubt on her guilt. "They're fine," she said. "You're ruining lives. You're taking them out because you don't like the way I run my house." The child, her smaller sister, moved forward and placed the ragged bear into Marcus's hand. "Please save my brother," she whispered, and then, for the first time since Marcus returned, she let herself be picked up without flinching. The social worker moved like a surgeon whose hand had been steady for years. "We will place the children in protective custody for a short period to assess and determine the proper course of action," she said. June's protests became background noise, like the rattling of a loose shutter. Part 8. The Reckoning. Once the authorities had the children in protective custody, the procedural machine hummed. Witnesses, Mrs. Langley, Ms. Ortega, signed statements with words like neglect, emotional control, and pattern of using excessive discipline. The social worker cataloged the implements found in June's drawer and recorded the child's drawings. A detective with kind eyes and a worn brow interviewed June with form questions. She was careful at first, spinning a tale of being a devoted mother who had protected her charges from bullies and bad influences. When the evidence was placed on the table in the form of photos and text messages, her voice sharpened into spite. "You're all wrong," she hissed, tears drying and rage blooming. "You have no right. But the law is not a thing that leans on personal righteousness. It is the measuring of truth against evidence." The text messages, the implements, the testimony that Mrs. Langley provided, these formed the basis of an interim custody order. June found herself escorted outside with instructions to remain away from the house. She argued as police took notes, as social workers drew circles around items in the house that could not be left behind. The neighborhood did not handle scandal quietly. People clustered at windows and doorways, their whispers like the rustling of wind-driven leaves. Some stood with their backs straight, feeling the justice had been done. Others looked uncertain, caught between the recognition of a wrong and the fear of having been a fool to trust the polished figure of June all these years. Eli was placed in a short-term foster care placement supervised by the social service agency, while the girl, Marcus's other child, was offered the option of staying in a family shelter until an assessment could decide on the proper place for them. Marcus applied for emergency custody in a civil hearing with a calmness that belied the storm in him. He wanted the children home, wanted the quilt on the couch to be the same quilt he had folded years ago, but he also knew the legal system did not move like a man with a map. It moved in the measured rhythms of protecting a child's future. The hearing established a protective order that prevented June from contact with the children pending investigation. The relief that passed through everyone when the order was signed and stamped mimicked the way a wound breathes when a bandage is finally loosened. Both pain and relief. July felt like a place of new beginnings and terrible admissions. June's house stood silent, staged, and maternal no more. The social worker, Maria, who had a soft, practical manner, told Marcus what they would begin next. Medical assessments for the children, psychological counseling, gathering of statements from anyone with a claim to the truth. Marcus felt his body go taut with both relief and the wetting of responsibility. He had not been home when the wounds were inflicted, but now he had the chance to mend them. He would learn to be the father again. Part 9. The Rescue. The most honest part of rescue is that it is not a moment but a series of mornings. The day Eli was brought to Marcus, the weather held a thin, forgiving light. Marcus sat nervously in the empty living room, the air smelling faintly of dust and old coffee. The social worker arrived with a small boy in a blue windbreaker and a blanket around his shoulders. Eli's eyes were cautious but darker than the days Marcus remembered. The boy had been taught to be careful. When their eyes met, something like recognition passed, a name's contour found in muscle memory. Eli did not rush. He did something worse and braver. He allowed himself to stand on the steps and to be seen. Marcus walked toward him and stopped at a careful distance. "Eli," he said softly. The boy lifted his chin. "Dad." His question was both young and old, a currency exchanged that made Marcus's throat close. "Yes," Marcus said. He wanted to crucify the world with the words "I swear." Instead, he said nothing grandiose. "Yes." When the social worker handed him a small box of the child's things, Marcus felt a collapse and a lift at once. The box contained a torn picture of a son, a muddy shoe, a small plastic truck, and a piece of string with a knot that the boy had used to tie his blanket. He pulled the boy close in a careful motion that respected the space the boy needed. The child clung, but not with desperation, an assessment that felt like measurement. That night, it's true to the narrative arc, they slept with the lights on. The boy woke several times, calling for June in the kind of voice that made Marcus's heart twist. The voice a child uses when the pattern of day and night is warped. He flinched at sudden shadows. There were moments when he hoarded his crackers. Marcus understood the psychology. When you don't know where your next appeasement will come from, you keep food as a stockpile. He let the boy keep the crackers in a small paper bag in the nightstand. Counseling began. A child psychologist named Dr. Hemmings used toys and soft voice to extract the truth without sedation. He approached the children like a gardener approaches a neglected pot. Patient, insistent, offering sunlight. He did not rush the boy to a story he could not tell. He used art therapy because children have a way of drawing what language cannot hold. Eli's drawings at first were bounded. Over weeks the sons became full once again. His house drawings acquired an open door. The girls' drawings moved from locked doors to small, hopeful figures on porch steps. Marcus learned small things that mattered more than big gestures. The way Eli's hands could relax when a certain lullaby was put on. How the girl's shoulders dropped when Marcus brushed her hair while she drew. How the boy would sometimes stay late with Dr. Hemmings to make small paper boats he could set in a tub without drying them for fear their water might be taken away. Marcus learned this, and, in learning, he morphed from the stoic protector into something more accessible, an engaged father. While the legal wheels continued to grind, the prosecution deliberated, witnesses were interviewed, and June's past was laid on the table in court. The most intimate part of resolution happened in the private, not in televised shouting. The children were not just victims. They were children opening like small, stubborn flowers learning to take in air. During the first night in his custody, Eli slept curled at the foot of Marcus's bed. Marcus lay awake and listened to the shallow breaths. The house's old curtains let in morning like a promise. Marcus whispered a vow that had once been folded into a letter and left unwritten. "I will not let you be taken like that again." Legal consequences began to line up. June faced charges not of cinematic brutality but of child endangerment, neglect, and unlawful restraint. The instruments she had used were catalogued as evidence. The court's process was slow and bureaucratic but lawful, and in the end June sought treatment. The law delivered consequences that were measured: placement in a program for treatment, supervised visits denied, mandatory therapy. The neighborhood watched June escorted from the house, the curtains closing on a life that had once been trusted. Marcus, despite his impulses, did not gloat. He felt vindication, but alongside it the heavy residue of his own past failures. He had left to build a future. That future had been interrupted. Now he had a chance to make a new life. He would not squander it. Part 10. The Long Road Home. Time is a patient mason. The months following the rescue were not a tidy montage. They were a slow, sometimes painful reality of appointments, legal meetings, and small breakthroughs. Marcus learned to be patient in ways that surprised him. The children's nightmares eased, though not in a linear fashion. Some nights were worse than others. Some days were small victories. He learned to put out an extra cup at dinner without preening and to let the girl paint outside the lines. Acrylic spreading like a child's rebellion that had the imprint of bravery. A year later, the house on Cedar Street was different. It smelled of cooking more than bleach. It had a patchwork of finger-painting prints stuck to the wall near the sink where the girls' drawings were pinned in a tradition Marcus had insisted on. There were stuffed things in the corner of the living room, not arranged in a display but strewn as if battles had been fought and won. The children had amended their posture. Eli's laughter had returned. A thin, new sound that found the edges of rooms uncertainly, then grew bolder. He rode a small bike down the sidewalk and sometimes fell, as children do. The girl, no longer a small cipher, drew suns on paper with both eyes open and sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, hummed a tune Marcus recognized from his time as a father. One he'd sung to Maya on nights when the world felt small and dangerous. There was a quiet scene in late spring when Marcus sat on the porch swing and watched the girl run off to chase a neighbor's dog. She returned sweaty and joyous, hair untamed. She threw herself into Marcus's arms and, in a voice that had shed some of its fear, said, "We can plant flowers here. Daddy," the word daddy, cut through months of guard like a gentle blade. Marcus thought of Maya then and a feeling so complicated he couldn't name it. Thankfulness, guilt, the knowledge that grief had done something to him that allowed him to be present now. He did not delude himself. He had failed once to keep the children from pain. That failure had scarred him and informed everything he did now. But the new days were an apprenticeship in forgiveness and in the fierceness of staying. There were nights, after the children had been put down, when Marcus would sit in the study and look at pictures of them, the old photographs mended into albums that felt like history and promise. He wrote letters without sending them sometimes. Letters to June detailing all the ways she had harmed them, letters to himself reminding him of the vow he had once made, letters to Maya in which he confessed simple, stupid things and then laughed quietly at the impossibility of her reading them. He made sure the legal measures stood firm. He attended hearings, and the law placed June in a program that mixed punitive oversight with required therapy. In the years after the rescue, the girl would sometimes draw the house with a wide door, a sun, and a truck parked outside. Eli would draw people playing. The child who had once asked Marcus at the front door so simply to please save my brother had been the linchpin of a change that rippled. In the end, the antagonist's possible redemption remained ambiguous. June was not a cartoon villain in a bowler hat. She was a woman birthed by trauma and, in her way, trying to survive by constructing structures that kept her safe at others' expense. The legal consequences were real, the emotional and societal ones complex and unresolved. She entered a program where she would be required to confront her past. Whether she would be transformed or remain a cautionary figure was something the court could not decide for her. The children, for their part, learned that adults could fail and yet sometimes redeem themselves by steady presence. That seemed to be the deeper, aching moral. The world offers both harm and repair, sometimes from the same socket. Months later, in a quiet evening that had only the sound of the fridge and the muted hum of a late television in another room, Marcus sat on the porch and wrote a message into his phone. It was both an invitation and an offering, carried like one might carry a candle into a dark hall. He wrote things that did not demand answers but asked for company. "Where are you watching from today?" He typed this out, feeling the old soldier's hesitation about exposing himself. He hit send like a quiet, earnest confession. He then paused and looked at the children playing with glue and paper across the table. The girl's small hand found his and squeezed. "Please save my brother," she said softly, not as a plea now but as a memory they shared, a talisman against forgetting. Marcus smiled, his face unguarded and honest for the first time in a long time. "We already did," he said, voice as steady as a new oath. They would have rough days ahead, therapy sessions, legal follow-ups, and the slow reconstruction of trust. But they would do it together. And to you, the reader, if you have reached this place in the story, what do you hold when you see a child who needs rescue? Who taught you how to be brave? Who keeps you steady when the world seems to demand only performance? Share it if you can. Tell someone that the small, persistent acts of watching over a child, calling a social worker, checking a bruised arm, offering a sandwich matter. Have you ever witnessed a wrong and not known how to act? What stopped you and what might change if you saw it now? How does your heart answer the quiet plea, "Please save my brother," when it is whispered in a voice that cannot defend itself? In the hush that followed, the children painted sons and doors and people who could be trusted. Marcus kept watch and, for the first time in a long while, he let himself believe that the work of repair could be done, not in the single heroic act that makes headlines, but in the many small mornings when someone shows up and chooses to stay.